She placed a folder on my dining table like it was a business meeting. Not a question, not a conversation. A folder. I've been sitting at that same table for 31 years. I ate breakfast there the morning after Mary Ann's funeral. I read the paper there every Sunday before the world got too loud for newspapers. I've had more quiet mornings at that table than I could ever count. And on that particular Sunday afternoon, my daughter-in-law Rebecca sat across from me, adjusted the folder so it was perfectly centered in front of her, folded her hands on top of it, and said, calm as anything, "Harold, we think the house should go to Daniel's family." I looked at the folder. I didn't touch it. I asked her, "What do you mean by should?" She didn't hesitate. That's the part that stayed with me. She didn't pause, didn't soften, didn't look at my son to check if this was still the plan. She just said, "It should eventually belong to our family. There's no reason to make this complicated." Daniel was sitting right beside her, quiet. His hands were flat on the table. He wasn't looking at me. I looked at him for a moment, then back at her. Rebecca continued. She said I'd had the house for decades, that Daniel should have something to pass forward, that it was only practical. She said it the way someone says something they've rehearsed, not because they're being dishonest, but because they've already had the argument inside their own head, and they've already won it there. And then she said the thing that made everything go still. "You promised." I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I just sat there with those two words between us, like something that had been dropped from a great height. She was right that a promise existed. She was wrong about what it meant. I pushed my chair back slowly, stood up, walked to the old pine cabinet in the corner of the room, the one I built myself back in 1987, the one Mary Ann always said looked slightly crooked but never once asked me to fix. I opened the bottom drawer, all the way in the back, behind a folded set of insurance documents and an old property survey. There was a thin brown envelope. I carried it back to the table, set it down. Rebecca looked at it, and something shifted in her face. Not dramatically. Not the way people look in movies when they've been caught. It was subtler than that. It was the look of someone who recognizes something they haven't thought about in years, something they'd filed away and assumed was gone. I looked at her and asked, "Do you remember signing this?" She didn't answer right away. And Daniel, for the first time since he walked through my door that afternoon, looked up. "Now, before I tell you what was in that envelope, I want you to understand something about the house itself, because this story isn't really about a document. It's about what we build and what we mean by it, and how those two things can drift apart from each other without anyone noticing until they're sitting across a table with a folder and 30 years of assumption between them. I bought 38 Alderwick Lane in 1979. It wasn't a beautiful house when I bought it. It had a sagging porch, a basement that flooded every spring, single-pane windows that rattled all winter, and wallpaper in the front room that I'm convinced was selected specifically to make people feel uneasy. The previous owners had let it go, not out of neglect exactly, more like they'd run out of will. Some houses do that to people. They ask too much, and the people inside them eventually stop answering. I was a restoration carpenter, have been most of my adult life. I worked for a firm in Portland for almost 20 years before I went out on my own, and the work I did, the work I loved, was the kind most contractors didn't want. Bringing old houses back, not renovating them in the sense of making them modern, restoring them in the sense of returning them to what they were intended to be. There's a difference. Renovation is about making something new from something old. Restoration is about understanding what something was before time got to it, and then giving it back its dignity. I knew what 38 Alderwick Lane was before time got to it. I could see it in the bones, the post and beam framing, the wide plank floors under 3 layers of linoleum, the original transom windows above the interior doors. painted shut for years but still structurally sound. The house had been built by someone who cared, and it was waiting, patiently, the way old things do, for someone to care again. Marianne thought I was out of my mind. She told me so on the drive home from the first showing. She said it was too much. She said we didn't have the money or the time. She said I was seeing potential where there was only a problem. And then we drove back out there on a Thursday evening because she wanted one more look, and she walked through every room again by herself, and when she came back outside she said, "All right, but the wallpaper in the front room goes first." That was Marianne. We spent the better part of 3 years putting that house back together. Not all at once. We had jobs. We had a life. We had a son who was growing up and needed things. But on weekends, on evenings, on the occasional stretch when I had a lighter week at work, we chipped away at it. I rebuilt the porch from the framing up, reglazed the windows, pulled up the linoleum, and refinished the floors underneath. Marianne stripped the wallpaper, all of it, every room, and we found the original plaster beneath, and she spent weeks patching and skimming it smooth. The workshop came in the second year. There was a small, detached structure in the backyard, a garden shed technically, but built with more intention than that. Solid frame, good foundation, better than it had any right to be. Marianne wanted to convert it into a proper workspace. She'd started restoring furniture by then, a hobby she'd picked up from watching me, though she became better at certain things than I ever was, particularly the finish work. She had patience for detail that I respected enormously and occasionally found exhausting. We cleared out the shed, insulated it, ran electricity, put in proper lighting, built a long workbench along the back wall, put up shelves, brought in the tools, and from that point on, the workshop was as much a part of the property as the house itself. Maybe more, in certain ways. It was where we spent hours that weren't accounted for in any schedule, where we worked side by side without needing to talk much, where neighbors started showing up with things, an old rocker with a broken spindle, a kitchen table with a damaged leg, a dresser that had been in someone's family since before anyone could remember. We fixed things. We restored things. We charged barely anything. That wasn't the point. Marianne used to say that a house is only worth what it allows people to remember. I thought I understood what she meant when she said it. I thought she meant the family, our family, the memories we made in those rooms. And that was part of it. But later, watching the workshop become what it became, a place where other people brought the things they couldn't bring themselves to throw away, I understood that she'd meant something larger. She meant that a home justifies its existence not just by sheltering the people inside it, but by creating space for what matters to the people around it. That idea was always just the way we lived. We didn't discuss it as a philosophy. We didn't announce it to anyone. It was simply what the house was for. Daniel grew up in that house. He knows the smell of sawdust and linseed oil better than most people know the smell of their own homes. He spent Saturday mornings in the workshop watching us work. He learned to use a hand plane before he learned to drive. He understood growing up that the house on Alderwick Lane was not a luxury. It was a practice. It was the physical result of two people deciding year by year that this was the kind of life worth building. He moved out at 23, built his own life, did well, married Rebecca. I liked Rebecca in the beginning, and I want to be clear about that. I still do in the complicated way you like someone who is capable of being sensible, but who sometimes makes decisions from a different set of values than your own. She is intelligent. She is organized. She loves my son in her own particular way. She has always been good to him. But Rebecca thinks in terms of assets. Not coldly. It's not a flaw in her character exactly. It's more like a lens. When she looks at something, she asks what it's worth and how it can be used. There's nothing wrong with that in most contexts. In a conversation about retirement accounts or insurance policies, it's actually a very useful way to think. It becomes a problem when the thing you're looking at is someone else's home and the someone else is still living in it. Marianne passed 11 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed late, moved fast. She was gone inside of 7 months from the day they told us. I won't spend much time on that part of the story because it belongs to me in a way that isn't suited to recounting. Some losses you carry whole and private, and you don't need to put them into words for them to be real. What I will say is that after she was gone, the house became a different kind of project. I wasn't restoring it anymore. It was restored. What I was doing was maintaining it, keeping it the way it ought to be. And the workshop became not a comfort exactly, but a continuation. A place where the thing we'd built together kept going without her. I still take in pieces for people, still charge barely anything, still spend hours on something, not because it's efficient, but because it's right. About 4 years after Marianne died, I went through a period where I seriously considered selling the property. Maintaining a house at my age on a fixed income takes more than most people account for. The roof had needed work. The heating system was old. There was a point where the arithmetic felt like it was winning. I mentioned it to Daniel. I said I was thinking about it, said I wasn't sure the house made sense anymore. What happened next was something I have always appreciated him for. He came over, without Rebecca at first, just him. And he sat in the workshop with me for an entire afternoon, and he told me plainly that he didn't want me to sell it, not for his sake. He said it for Marianne's sake. He said the house was one of the last places where he could feel that she had existed, where he could still almost see her. He said that mattered to him. I believed him. And it mattered to me that he said it. Later, the three of us, me, Daniel, and Rebecca, sat down together and talked about the long term. Rebecca was there this time, and she was thoughtful about it. She said that she understood what the house meant, and that if there was a way to make sure it stayed connected to the family, she wanted that too. We talked through the finances. We talked through the practical realities, and eventually we arrived at an agreement. The agreement was about conditions, Harold's conditions, not demands, conditions, meaning things that would determine whether the house could eventually pass to them in good conscience. The primary condition was the workshop. I told them what Marianne believed about the workshop and what I believed about it. I told them that if they eventually received the house, that workspace needed to remain a community restoration space, not forever, but for a period long enough to prove the principle. I wasn't asking them to run it the way we did. I wasn't asking them to give up anything substantial. I was asking them to understand that the property came with a purpose and that the purpose wasn't negotiable. Rebecca agreed. She nodded. She said she understood and that it was a fair condition. Daniel agreed. He signed. Rebecca signed. I signed. We all had copies. I kept the original in the brown envelope in the bottom drawer of the pine cabinet. I never imagined, 7 years later, I'd be pulling it back out of that drawer. Life moves in a direction that feels logical at the time. Rebecca's thinking evolved. She began to see the workshop differently, not as a community space, but as a structural asset. She mentioned once, a couple of years back, that the footprint would make a nice guest suite. I didn't respond to that. I filed it away the way I file most things that haven't yet become a problem. Then the folder appeared on the table, and I understood that what hadn't become a problem had quietly become one without me noticing when. I sat back down across from them with the envelope between us. Rebecca was looking at it with the expression of someone trying to remember something they haven't thought about in years, the specific expression of a person reconstructing a memory they'd assumed was irrelevant. Daniel had gone very quiet. I didn't open the envelope immediately. I just left it on the table and looked at my son. Because here's the thing about that afternoon that I need you to understand before we go any further. The document was in the room, But the real conversation hadn't started yet. And the real conversation wasn't going to be about the house at all. Not really. It was going to be about something much quieter and much harder, and something that I hadn't even fully worked out the words for, until that moment when Daniel finally looked up at me. And I saw it. The thing he'd been carrying in since he walked through the door. The thing underneath the folder and the prepared speech, and the certainty that this would be straightforward. He looked like a man who already knew he was on the wrong side of something but had come too far to turn back. And somewhere in the back of my mind, behind everything else, was a second page in that envelope. One that Rebecca hadn't seen. One that Daniel didn't know existed. Not a legal document. Not a deed. Not a threat of any kind. Just a page I'd written to myself about 18 months ago, on a Tuesday evening, after a phone call I'd had with Daniel that I don't think he even remembers. A phone call where he'd mentioned, almost in passing, what the Alderwick Lane property might be worth in the current market. The word he'd used was, eventually. He said, "Dad, that place is going to be worth something eventually." And I'd said, "It's worth something now." And there'd been a pause that told me everything I needed to know about how differently we were looking at the same thing. I picked up the envelope. I looked at Rebecca, then at Daniel. And I said, "Before I open this, I want you to tell me something. What exactly do you remember agreeing to the last time we all sat down together?" The question landed differently than I expected, because Rebecca looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked at the table, and neither of them answered right away. And in that silence, I understood that what the three of us were about to discover was that memory is not simply about what happened. It's about what we needed to be true at the time, and how quietly that need rewrites the past without anyone giving permission. The envelope was still closed, but the look on their faces told me the conversation had already begun. Neither of them answered me. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the folder, not the rehearsed speech. Not even the way Rebecca had said, "You promised," like it was the closing argument in a case she'd already won. What stays with me is that silence after I ask them what they remembered agreeing to. 7 seconds. Maybe 8. I counted without meaning to. An old habit from the workshop. When you're waiting for wood glue to set, you learn to count silently instead of checking the clock. You learn that time has a texture when you pay attention to it. Those 7 seconds had a texture. Rebecca recovered first. She's good at that, at finding her footing quickly when the ground shifts. She said, "We agreed that the house would stay in the family, Harold. That was the whole point of the conversation." I nodded slowly. "That's part of what we agreed." "Yes. That's the part that matters," she said. And there it was. Not dishonesty, not manipulation. A completely sincere belief that she had identified the correct part of a complex thing, and everything else was detail. I've restored enough old houses to know what happens when someone decides the structural details are just detail. A transom window is just a window until the day the frame beneath it starts to rot, and you realize it was load-bearing in a way you hadn't accounted for. A small crack in a foundation is just cosmetic until the winter gets into it and the cosmetic becomes catastrophic. The things people decide are secondary have a way of becoming primary at precisely the wrong moment. I looked at Daniel. "And you?" He shifted in his seat. He's 44 years old and has his mother's eyes and his father's habit of going quiet when he doesn't know what to say. He said, "Dad, we're not trying to push you out of anything. We just think it makes sense to start talking about the future." "I agree," I said. "I've been thinking about the future for 31 years. I'm glad you want to join the conversation." That landed harder than I meant it to. I saw him absorb it. The slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible adjustment of his posture. He looked for just a moment like a man who has walked into a room he was certain he knew and found the furniture rearranged. Rebecca opened the folder. Inside was a printed document. Something she'd prepared. Property assessments. Market comparisons for the Portland area. Some figures I recognized and some I didn't. She'd done her research. I'll give her that. Harold, she said, sliding the top page toward me. The property is worth significantly more than it was when you bought it. We're not talking about taking anything from you. We're talking about making sure it's managed properly going forward. I looked at the page. I didn't pick it up. Managed, I said. Yes, maintained, planned for. I manage it fine, I said. I've managed it for 31 years. Of course, she said, and she smiled the particular smile of someone who is being patient. But at some point, Harold, the practical reality is, Rebecca, my voice stayed even. How old do you think I am? She paused. 76. And how old is the house? She looked uncertain. I don't know. Built in the 1891, I said. The house is 135 years old. It has outlasted 7 owners, 2 fires on the adjacent property, a flood, a renovation in the 60s that nearly ruined it, and 31 years of my care. I suspect it will outlast this conversation. A long pause. Then Daniel, quietly, Dad, I'm not being difficult, I said, and I meant it. I'm being precise. There's a difference. You both know that. I left the envelope on the table between us and stood up to put the kettle on. Not to be dismissive. I genuinely wanted tea, and I find that the act of making something, even something small, returns a room to its correct proportions. Mary Ann taught me that. She used to say that the best thing you could do in the middle of a hard conversation was give everyone's hands something to do. While the water heated, I talked to them from the kitchen doorway, kept my voice ordinary. I told them I understood why they were there. I told them that I knew Rebecca thought practically, and that I didn't think that was a character flaw. I told them that I understood Daniel wanted stability. For himself, for his marriage, for the future they were building together. I understood all of it. What I didn't understand, I said, was why understanding the future had to involve deciding when my present was finished. Rebecca started to respond. I held up one hand, gently, not dismissively, and said, "Let me finish." She waited. I said that I had spent my entire career restoring things other people had given up on. That the central lesson of that work, the one thing I'd learned so completely it had become part of how I thought, was that a thing's value is almost never what it appears to be on a surface assessment. You have to get inside it. You have to understand what it was built for, what it survived, what it was trying to remain. The kettle clicked off. I poured 3 cups without asking if they wanted any. When I came back to the table, Rebecca was looking at the brown envelope. "What's in it?" she asked. "Memory," I said, which wasn't the whole answer, but wasn't wrong either. I set the cups down, sat back in my chair, picked up the envelope, and this time I opened it. Inside was a folded document, 3 pages, and behind it a single handwritten page that I kept face down for the moment. I unfolded the 3 pages and set them flat on the table. Rebecca leaned forward. Her eyes moved across the top of the page. The date, the heading, the names. I watched her read. I watched the moment she reached the section about the workshop. Her eyes slowed, then stopped, then went back to the beginning of that paragraph and read it again. She sat back. Daniel leaned across and read from where she'd left off. Nobody spoke for a while. Then Rebecca said, carefully, "This is about the workshop." "Among other things," I said. "We agreed to keep the workshop running as," she read directly from the page, "a community restoration and repair space for a period no shorter than 5 years following transfer of the property." "That's right." She set the page down, looked at me. "Harold, We weren't planning to tear the workshop down. I know. We were talking about converting it, eventually, into something more practical for a guest suite, I said. You mentioned that. 2 years ago, I think. Maybe 2.5. She blinked. She hadn't realized I'd registered that. The agreement doesn't say anything about a guest suite, I said. It says community restoration space, for 5 years minimum. That was the condition under which the house could eventually transfer. Daniel was looking at his own signature at the bottom of the last page. He was looking at it the way you look at a photograph of yourself from a long time ago, with the slight disorientation of recognizing yourself in something you barely remember living. I signed this, he said. It wasn't a question. You did. So did Rebecca. So did I. A pause. I don't really remember signing it. I know, I said, and I wasn't angry about that. Not exactly. There was something sad about it, but anger wasn't the right word for what I felt. I said, we signed it 7 years ago. It was a Tuesday in October. Marianne had been gone about 4 years. You came over because I told you I was thinking about selling. You sat in the workshop for an entire afternoon and told me you didn't want me to sell it. Do you remember that part? He looked up. Yes, I remember that. Good. The document came out of that conversation. We all agreed that if the house ever transferred to you, the workshop would stay as it was, for the community, for the purpose your mother and I built it for. It wasn't controversial at the time. You both signed without hesitation. Rebecca said, we were thinking about the family connection, not a commercial operation. It was never a commercial operation, I said. I charged people almost nothing. Still do. I mean, it wasn't something we thought of as a long-term obligation. And yet you signed a document that described it as exactly that. The room went quiet again. Outside there was wind off the water. Portland in October carries that particular sound, low and constant, like the city exhaling. I've lived with that sound for so long, it doesn't register anymore unless I'm paying attention. Right then, I was paying attention to everything. This is the moment in the story where I want to be careful, because the easy version of what happened next is that I had the document and they were caught and everyone had to admit I was right. That would be a satisfying story, maybe. Clean. Simple. But that's not what actually happened. What happened was more complicated and I think more true. Rebecca didn't crumble. She didn't apologize immediately. She looked at the document for a long time, and then she looked at me, and she said something that I hadn't expected and that I've thought about many times since. She said, Harold, when was the last time you asked yourself whether the way you're living in this house still makes sense? I held her gaze. She continued, not unkindly. You're 76. You're in this house alone. The workshop takes hours of your week. The maintenance takes more. I'm not saying you can't do it. I'm saying, has anyone asked you recently whether you want to keep doing it? Or have we all just assumed that because you've always done it, you always will? I didn't answer right away. Because the honest answer was complicated. And the complicated answer was that she wasn't entirely wrong. There are mornings when the house feels large in a way that has nothing to do with square footage. When I walk down the hall to the kitchen and the silence has a weight to it. When I stand in the workshop and I'm aware, in a way I try not to dwell on, that I'm the only one standing in it. I miss Marianne every day. Not dramatically, not in the way people describe grief in films, with sudden overwhelming waves, more like a persistent low note underneath everything else, a frequency you've stopped consciously hearing, but that shapes the sound of every room. So no, Rebecca wasn't entirely wrong, but she was wrong about what followed from it. I said, Rebecca, I appreciate that question. I mean that genuinely, but I want you to notice something. I slid the document back toward her. You came here today with a folder, a prepared folder. You'd done research, you'd printed assessments, you'd worked out the conversation in advance. At no point before today, like not once in the past year, not in a phone call, not in passing, did you sit down with me and ask how I was. Not in the way you just asked it now. You asked it just now because the conversation wasn't going the way you planned. She opened her mouth, then closed it. That's not an accusation, I said. I'm just noting it, because the question is a good one, and it deserves better than to be used as a tactic. Daniel put both hands flat on the table. He said, Dad, that's not fair. Which part? He struggled with it. We've checked in on you. We've called. We've come by. You have, I said, and I'm grateful for it. But there's a difference between checking in and asking. You called me 3 months ago. Do you remember what we talked about? He thought about it. The market, I said. The Portland real estate market. You mentioned it almost at the end of the call. You said the property was going to be worth something eventually. I said it's worth something now. And you went quiet. He remembered. I could see it happening. The specific memory returning. Not as a fact, but as a feeling. The slight shift in his expression that meant it was landing the way it was supposed to. That phone call, I said, is why this envelope is on the table today. Not because I wanted to trap anyone, not because I was angry, because after we hung up, I sat in the workshop for about an hour and I thought about what it means when your son starts describing your house in the future tense. I want to stop here and say something directly. If you've ever been the adult in a room where someone younger is making plans around your life as though your preferences are a formality, you know the specific quality of that feeling. It's not rage, it's not even hurt exactly. It's more like a sudden clarity. The clarity of understanding that in someone else's mind, you've already begun the process of becoming a memory. I'm 76 years old. I restored a house that is 135 years old. I've outlasted my wife, 2 dogs, a business partnership that fell apart badly, 3 vehicles, and more winters than I've bothered counting. I am not finished. I am not a formality. And the house on Alderwick Lane is not a future asset. It is my present life. If you're watching this and you understand what I mean by that, if you've sat at a table where someone you love was already speaking about your life in the past tense, I want you to know that this story is for you. And if you haven't been there yet, stay close. Because the second half of what happened that Sunday afternoon is the part that surprised even me. The 3 pages were still on the table. Rebecca was looking at them without really reading them anymore. Daniel was looking at his hands. I picked up the 4th page, the handwritten one, and held it without turning it over yet. There's one more thing in the envelope, I said. Rebecca looked up. It's not a legal document. It won't change anything about ownership. It won't surprise you the way you're expecting to be surprised. I paused. It's something I wrote to myself about 18 months ago. After that phone call, Daniel looked at it. I'm going to read part of it to you, I said. Not all of it. Some of it belongs to me, but part of it belongs to this conversation. And before I turned that page over, I looked at my son, really looked at him, the way you look at someone you've known longer than they've known themselves. And I thought about the afternoon he'd spent in the workshop telling me he didn't want me to sell. The sincerity of that, the way he'd meant it completely, without any of the complexity that had arrived in the years since. People don't change their hearts. Not usually. What changes is the distance between their hearts and their habits. Daniel had meant everything he said 7 years ago. He still meant it, somewhere beneath the folder and the folder's logic. I was certain of that. But meaning something and remembering why you meant it are 2 different kinds of knowing, and the years between them can quietly move a person further than they realize. I turned the handwritten page over. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. Daniel sat very still, and outside the wind came in off Casco Bay the way it always does in October, low and steady and older than any of us. I looked at what I'd written, and then I started reading. What I read didn't shout, it didn't accuse, it didn't threaten. It was just a 74-year-old man sitting alone in a workshop on a Tuesday evening, trying to make sense of what it felt like to realize that the people he loved most had begun, slowly and without meaning to think of him as something that was winding down, rather than someone who was still going. I read it quietly, and by the time I got to the third paragraph, Daniel was no longer looking at the table. He was looking at me, and whatever he saw in my face in that moment, whatever finally came through, was the thing that changed the shape of the afternoon entirely. Because I saw it happen. I saw the exact second when the conversation stopped being about a house. What came next wasn't what any of us had walked in expecting. And the document, the signed one, the one with their names at the bottom, turned out to matter far less than the one I'd written for no one but myself. I read 3 paragraphs out loud. Then I stopped. Not because the page ended, because my voice did what voices sometimes do when the words you've written stop being words and start being something heavier. I cleared my throat, folded the page once, set it face down on the table beside the signed agreement. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. That was new. Rebecca is not a woman who leaves silence unfilled for long. She processes quickly, and she responds quickly, and the space between those two things is usually very short. But she left that one alone. She sat with it. And I was grateful for that, more than I knew how to say at the time. Daniel hadn't moved. He was still looking at me with that expression I'd caught a few minutes earlier, the one that had shifted the shape of the afternoon. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was closer to recognition. The particular look of a person who has just understood something they should have understood earlier, and is in the process of deciding what to do with that understanding. I've seen that look before. I've seen it on the faces of homeowners when I show them what's underneath a surface they thought was fine. When I pull back a section of wall and the problem is worse than they imagined but also clearer. There's always that moment of adjustment. The moment where the story they'd been telling themselves has to make room for what's actually true. Daniel was in that moment. I gave him room to be in it. Finally, he said, "Can I read the whole page?" I looked at him for a moment. Then I picked up the handwritten sheet and handed it to him. He read it slowly. I watched his eyes move down the page. I watched him get to the middle section, the part I hadn't read aloud, the part that was more personal than anything I'd put into a conversation in years. And I watched something happen in his face that I don't have an exact word for. Not crying. He didn't cry, but there was a quality of his stillness that changed. Like a room where someone has just turned off a noise you hadn't consciously registered as noise until it stopped. When he finished, he set the page down. He didn't hand it to Rebecca. She didn't reach for it. Some instinct in the room told everyone that the page had found the person it was written for, even though I'd written it for myself. Daniel said, "Dad, I'm sorry." Just that. 3 words. No construction around them, no qualification. The kind of apology that's been stripped of everything except what it actually is. I nodded. Let it sit. Then I said, "Tell me what you're apologizing for, specifically. Not because I need to hear it, because I think you need to say it out loud." He thought about it carefully. That's something I've always respected about my son. When he takes a thing seriously, he takes it fully. He said, "I started thinking about the house as something that was going to come to me. And somewhere in that thinking, I stopped. I stopped making sure you knew that wasn't how I thought about you." "There it is," I said quietly. Rebecca had her hands folded in her lap. She was looking at the table. When she looked up, her expression had changed considerably from the woman who had arrived with a prepared folder and a straight back, and the particular composure of someone who believes they are managing a situation. She looked now like someone in a conversation she hadn't prepared for, because she hadn't known this was the conversation she needed to have. She said, "I want to be honest with you, Harold." "Please," I said. "I was worried. I am worried. About Daniel's future, about stability, about what happens if—" She paused, chose her words carefully. "About what happens when circumstances change, for any of us. I wasn't trying to take something from you. I was trying to secure something for him." "I know," I said, and I meant it without reservation. "Rebecca, I know, and I want you to understand something. The fact that your intentions were good doesn't mean the approach wasn't wrong. Those two things can both be true at the same time." She absorbed that. "You came in here with a folder," I said. "You had already decided what the conversation was going to be. You'd researched the property value, you'd framed the argument, you'd chosen the moment. All of that was careful and intelligent and organized. But you did it all without asking me one simple question first." She waited. "What do I want?" The question sat in the room. I said, "Not what should happen to the house eventually. Not what makes practical sense. What do I—" Harold Mercer, 76 years old, still here, still present, still the person who lives in this house and works in that workshop and gets up every morning and makes coffee and has opinions and plans and a life that is still happening. What do I want? Rebecca's voice, when it came, was quieter than anything she'd said all afternoon. "I never asked you that?" "No," I said. "You didn't. I should have." "Yes." A long moment passed. Then something unexpected happened. Rebecca looked at the folder she'd brought, the one with the property assessments and the market comparisons, and she closed it, pushed it to the side of the table. Not dramatically, not as a gesture. Just put it aside the way you put aside something you've realized you don't need. That small movement meant more to me than any apology she could have constructed. I want to pause here, because this is the part of the story where I think people expect a turn. The dramatic reversal. The moment where I announce something that changes the legal landscape, where I produce another document that reshuffles everything, where I win. There was no winning. That was never the point. The point was sitting in my dining room with my son and his wife and saying what needed to be said clearly enough that it couldn't be covered over again by practicality or assumption or the comfortable distance of not quite addressing things directly. That's harder than winning. Winning is clean. It has an ending. This was messier and more real and more important. I refilled the tea. None of us had drunk much of it. I told them about the handwritten page, not what was on it exactly, but why I'd written it. I told them about the Tuesday evening in the workshop, 18 months ago. About sitting at the long workbench after Daniel's call and feeling something I struggled for a while to name. I told them that I'd eventually identified the feeling as a specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of being alone, which I'd made a kind of peace with, but the loneliness of being in a room with people who love you and realizing that their love has begun to organize itself around your absence rather than your presence, that they were already, in some gentle and well-intentioned way, grieving me before I was gone. And that is an extraordinarily isolating thing to discover. Rebecca put her hand over her mouth briefly, just for a moment, then lowered it. Daniel said, "Is that what the phone call felt like?" "That's what the phone call felt like," I said. He was quiet for a long time. Then, I didn't realize. "I know you didn't. That's what I'm telling you. That's why the page exists. Not to accuse you, but because I needed to write it down before I forgot how clearly I'd seen it. Old men have a habit of talking themselves out of things. I didn't want to talk myself out of this. There's something I've learned over 76 years that I don't say often because it tends to sound like a fortune cookie when you say it plainly. But in the context of that afternoon, it was simply true. The people who love us can cause us harm without malice and without awareness, and the only thing that stops that particular kind of harm is honesty arriving before resentment does. I was lucky. The honesty arrived first. just barely. After a while, the three of us moved from the dining room out to the workshop. I'm not sure who suggested it. I think I just stood up and went out there and they followed. That's happened before. With different people, in different circumstances. There's something about the workshop that invites continuation. Marianne used to say it was because the space was built for process rather than conclusion. You go into a workshop to work on something. You come out when the work is done. It doesn't pretend to be a finished place. The October light in there was the low amber kind, the specific quality of afternoon light in Maine in autumn that makes everything look like it's being preserved. I've always loved that light. Marianne loved it too. She used to work late into those October afternoons because she said the light made it easier to see the grain of the wood properly. I showed Rebecca the current project, an old library table that a woman in the neighborhood had brought in 3 weeks earlier. Solid mahogany, possibly late Victorian, one leg badly damaged and a section of the top surface that someone had covered with contact paper at some point, which is a crime I will not fully describe. I'd spent the first 2 weeks cleaning the surface and stabilizing the structure. The real work was still ahead. Rebecca looked at it carefully. She ran her hand along the edge of the tabletop. She said, "This is someone's furniture." "It is. Not yours. Never was mine. They'll take it back when it's done." She looked around the workshop, at the tools organized on the wall, not by size but by use sequence. The way Marianne had arranged them, the way I'd kept them since. At the shelves of supplies. At the long workbench with its worn surface and the particular accumulation of small marks that a workbench collects over decades of use. Each mark is a memory of something repaired. "You still do this for people," she said, "for the neighborhood. Every few weeks someone brings something in. How long has it been going on?" "Since about 1986, I said. "Marianne started it, really. She fixed a rocking chair for a woman down the street who couldn't afford to take it to a shop. Word got around." Rebecca stood there looking at the space for a long moment. Then she said something I hadn't expected. She said, "I think I forgot what this was." I looked at her. When I thought about the workshop, I was thinking about the square footage, the footprint, what it could be converted into. She paused. I forgot that it was already something. I didn't respond immediately. I let the statement exist in the space it deserved. Then I said, "That's the most important thing you've said today." She looked at me. "Not because it helps my case," I said. "Because it's true. And because it took courage to say it." Daniel had been standing near the door, hands in his jacket pockets. He came further into the room. He stood at the far end of the workbench and looked at the tools the way he used to look at them as a younger man, with a mixture of familiarity and respect, the look of someone who grew up around a craft without fully learning it, who knows enough to understand what he doesn't know. He said, "Mom used to let me hand her things in here." "She did," I said. "You were very serious about it. Very precise about which tool was which." A small smile. "I was terrible at the actual work." "You were," I agreed. "You had no patience for it at 12. Do I need patience for it now?" I looked at him. At the question underneath the question. At the 44-year-old man standing in the workshop where he'd spent Saturday mornings as a boy, asking something that was about much more than carpentry. "Come back on Saturday," I said. "We'll find out." He nodded, slowly, like a decision being made in real time. Now, I want to tell you about the weeks that followed, because the Sunday afternoon was not the end of anything. In my experience, the conversations that matter most aren't the ones that end things. They're the ones that change the direction of what continues. Rebecca called me the following Wednesday. Not to discuss the house, not to revisit the agreement or the document or any of the practical things she'd brought to the table. She called to ask about the library table, specifically what the woman who'd brought it in had said about it, what its history was. I told her what I knew. It had belonged to the woman's mother, had been in storage for nearly 20 years because it was damaged and she hadn't known what to do with it. She'd almost thrown it away 3 times, had finally brought it to the workshop because someone in the neighborhood mentioned I took in pieces. Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a long time to almost throw something away." "People do that with things that matter to them," I said. "They don't know how to fix them, so they keep them in a state of almost discarding. Better than letting go. Worse than taking care of." Another pause. "Harold, I want to apologize again. Properly this time. You apologized on Sunday." "Not really," she said. "I said I hadn't asked what you wanted. That was true, but it wasn't the whole thing." She took a breath. "I was treating the house like it was already yours to give away, like you'd already finished with it. And I did that because it was easier to think about your future in terms of what it would mean for us than to think about what it still means to you. That was selfish. I'm sorry." I held the phone for a moment. "Rebecca," I said, "I appreciate that. I genuinely do. And I want to say something back to you that I mean equally genuinely. You are allowed to think about your future. You're allowed to want security for Daniel and for yourself. Those aren't wrong things to want. What was wrong was the assumption that my timeline had to align with your planning. I understand that now. Good. Then we're somewhere better than we were on Sunday." She almost laughed. "Not quite. That's a low bar." "It's a start," I said. "Daniel came on Saturday. He arrived at 8 in the morning, which told me he'd thought about it during the week and decided to take it seriously. He was wearing clothes he didn't mind ruining, which told me the same thing. He brought coffee from the place on Commercial Street, which told me he remembered that I preferred theirs to the chain on the corner. Small things. But the small things are how you know whether a person has actually changed direction or just said they would. We worked on the library table together for most of the morning. I showed him how to assess the damaged leg, not just visually, but structurally. How to identify where the break had originated versus where it had propagated. How the repair had to address the origin, not the surface presentation, or the whole thing would fail again in a few years. He listened with the focused attention of someone who has decided to actually learn something rather than just be present. At one point he asked about the contact paper on the tabletop, how I was planning to remove it without damaging the mahogany beneath. I told him, slowly, with patience, with heat applied carefully and the right amount of solvent and a lot of time, that there was no fast version of that particular job, that if you rushed it, you'd lift the veneer with the adhesive, and what you'd have left would be worse than the contact paper. He nodded. Then he said, "Is that a general principle or just for this table?" I looked at him sideways. "Both." He smiled, and it was the smile of a man who understood he'd just received 2 lessons at once. We worked until early afternoon. Didn't solve the table. It wasn't a one-morning job. But we made real progress. The leg was stabilized by noon, and we'd cleared about a third of the contact paper without incident. At one point, working side by side at the bench, Daniel said, "Was Mom really this patient? With the detail work?" I thought about it. About Marianne at this same bench, with this same light, working on something with the same careful attention she brought to everything she decided mattered. "No," I said. He looked up. "She was worse," I said. "She had more patience than I ever developed. She could work on a single square inch of surface for an hour without feeling like she was wasting time." He considered that. "I'm somewhere in the middle," he said. "That's fine," I said. "The middle is where most good work happens." We didn't talk about the house that morning. Not directly, but everything we talked about was about the house in the way that things are about something without needing to name it. The signed agreement is still in the brown envelope in the bottom drawer of the pine cabinet. I haven't moved it. I don't intend to. It's not a threat, and it's not a promise. It's a record of a conversation we had 7 years ago when 3 people were trying to do right by something they all cared about. The fact that 2 of them forgot some of the specifics doesn't make the document less true. It makes the document more necessary. The handwritten page I keep separately now. In the workshop, in the small drawer at the right side of the bench where I keep things I want to be able to find easily. Not because I plan to read it to anyone else, because on the mornings when the house feels large and the low note beneath everything is louder than usual, it's useful to be reminded that I was clear-eyed once about what I wanted and why it mattered. I am still here. That's the essential thing. I am 76 years old and I am still here, still restoring things, still making coffee at this table, still watching October light come through the workshop windows the way it has come through them for 31 years. The house is not waiting to be inherited. It is being lived in. There's a version of this story, the version Rebecca brought to the table in her prepared folder, where the question is, who gets the property and when? I understand why that felt like the right question to her. It's a practical question, and practical questions have a certain kind of authority. But the version I'm living is different. In my version, the question is, what happens when the people you love understand, finally, that you are not a transition they have to manage, that you are a person they still have the chance to know? Daniel comes to the workshop most Saturdays now. Not everyone. He has his own life, and I don't want him there out of obligation, but most. He's getting better with the detail work. He still has limited patience for the very slow stages, which is accurate to his character, but he's learning that limited patience can still produce good work if you direct it correctly. Last Saturday, before he left, he looked at the library table. Nearly finished now, the legs solid, the surface restored, the mahogany back to something close to what it was intended to be, and he said, "The woman is going to be glad she didn't throw this away." "She is," I said. He picked up his jacket. At the door, he turned back. He said, "Dad, I remember signing the agreement now. I remember the conversation. I remember what we were trying to protect." I looked at him. "I think I finally understand what I was signing," he said. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I picked up the brown envelope from the workbench where I'd left it, and I put it back where it belongs, in the bottom drawer of the pine cabinet, behind the insurance documents and the property survey, in the dark of the drawer where things go when they've done their work and can rest. I didn't need to explain anything further. He already knew. A promise is not important, because someone can force you to honor it. It is important because once, at a particular table on a particular afternoon, you understood why it was worth making. And what I know now, what I didn't fully know when the folder appeared on my dining table that Sunday, or even when I pulled the envelope from the drawer, is that the most valuable thing in that brown envelope was never the signed document. It was the proof that once, my family had trusted each other enough to put something in writing. And that trust was still recoverable. It just needed to be reminded of itself. That is the whole story. A house on Alderwick Lane, a workshop behind it, a thin brown envelope, and a family that came very close to forgetting the difference between what they owned and what they meant to each other. I'm glad we remembered in time. If this story reached something in you, if you've ever sat at a table where someone was making plans around your life without quite asking you about it, or if you've ever been the one holding the folder and realized, too late, that you'd forgotten to ask the most important question, I'd like to know. Leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this stayed with you. Tell me if you've lived something like it. Tell me what you would have said at that table, or what you wish you'd said at a table of your own. And if you want to keep hearing stories like this one, stories about real families, real houses, real conversations that almost didn't happen, subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Every story I bring you is built the same way I restore furniture, slowly, carefully, with attention to what was there before the damage, and respect for what it was always trying to be. I'll see you in the next one.